Welcome to the Public Interest. This is a weekly program produced by the Ministry of the Presidency that allows for members of the media to interact with Guyana's head of state. As always, we have with us President David Granger. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
And usually on our panel, we'd have a representative from the private media and one from the state media, and today is no different. We have Mr. Jarrell Bryan from the Kaieteur News and from the Guyana Chronicle, Alva Solomon. Welcome, gentlemen. On today's program, sir, I want us to talk a little about biodiversity in the Guyana Shield. We are currently hosting the 4th International Congress on Biodiversity of the Guyana Shield, and you attended the opening ceremony. In your address, you said that if the Shield is to be effectively managed, regional cooperation and coordination is necessary. My question to you is, how do you envision countries within the Shield and in the Caribbean region working together to protect these important biological communities?
And thanks for that question. It's much more important than some people realize because there are 6 countries in the Guyana Shield, or part of Colombia, Venezuela, all of Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana, and parts of Brazil. But they're very important to the entire globe because they contribute to mitigating the effects of global warming, and they contain a significant portion of the world biodiversity, a vast array of species of birds and animals and so on. So it's very important and that Guyana protects it because Guyana is part of the Shield. And the Shield is, in my opinion, the single largest remaining untouched area of biodiversity in the world. So the importance cannot be underestimated. What I would say is that the preservation of the Shield, as intact as possible, the preservation of the Shield will help Guyanese, future generations of Guyanese, through investigation and study. We want to establish an institute there in Irokrama to learn about biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity. Right now, Guyana has a damaged part of its environment because of logging and mining. And we need to understand that the preservation or protection of our biodiversity is important to the future. Not just the short-term gains we can get from timber and mining, but the long-term gains in terms of biodiversity. So I hope that Guyana's efforts will have an impact on the rest of the continent in South America and also in the Caribbean, particularly through education, particularly through the investigation of these abundant resources. So that is how I see this being achieved. And Guyana, as a member of CARICOM, and also as a part of UNASUR, as a part of South America, is best placed to get both sub-regions, the continent and the Caribbean, on board in terms of biodiversity.
Thank you, sir. Jarrell Bryan.
How do you balance the need of private investors who would have long concessions and also the need to create jobs versus the protection of this, the landscape?
Well, it's a thin line, but every government must make the choice. If you damage the environment, it's forever. If you kill out your wild animals, it's forever. They'll be extinct. Extinction is forever. So it is the duty of a prudent government to make sure that both are done simultaneously. You have to walk on 2 legs. In this case, as you know, we have separated some of the environmental responsibilities in government from the extractive. That is to say, the Ministry of Natural Resources has shed some of its responsibilities for environmental protection, coastal zone management, wildlife protection, protected areas, and so on. So we're using the environmental sector under the Department of the Environment to be a watchdog over the extractive sector. So we can do both, but all we're asking is that the miners and loggers and other persons operating, quarrying and so on in the hinterland do so in a sustainable manner and a responsible manner. So in cases where, areas have been mined out, there could be reforestation. In areas where mining is going on continuously, we must make sure that the rivers are not contaminated. So indigenous communities which have use for the rivers are not going to be affected. So it's a question of responsibility. It's not one or the other. We can do both.
Okay.
Alva?
Mr. President, at the opening ceremony of Gaia Expo this year, you mentioned that there is not a proposal, but there's probably something in place to have biodiversity zones in each of the administrative regions of the country. How do you plan to have such a proposal effective?
Well, partly through the system of regionalization. As you know, we've created 3 new tongues, and we are aiming at creating another tongue, Madhya. And the intention is that every region should be administered by a capital tongue. But at the same time, as you're asking, we feel that Guyana is such a geographically and diverse, biologically diverse country, that every region should have a protected area. For example, there are parts of East Demerara where there's a particular ecological environment in terms of the wetlands. Rupununi may have dry, savannas. Maruko may be wet. So we're looking at different environments, and we feel that each region, under the guidance and governance of that regional tongue, the capital tongue and the regional administration, should be able to have an area that is protected. Right now we have areas in Shell Beach, in Kanuku, Kaitshore, and I think Conashen, and of course Irokram itself. But we want to see each region having its own protected area because we have been able to identify endangered species in all of the regions, and no 2 regions are the same. Guyana is lucky in that regard. And we feel it is achievable within the next 3 years or so. And we would like our future generations, children must be able to see our wildlife. We've got some of the most attractive and most interesting wildlife in the world in terms of the species of birds and caiman and harpy eagles and snakes and everything. So we feel that this policy of having regional protected areas is going to contribute to the overall objective of making Guyana a green economy.
Just a follow-up question to that. Is there a tourism pitch attached to that in terms of marketing Guyana?
Yes, ecotourism. There are tourists now who are not interested in just going on the beach and getting a tan. They want to see our interesting wildlife. They're bird watchers. Guyana has nearly 900 species of birds. Some of them are very rare. And we're trying to develop that. As you know, tourism responsibility is being transferred to the Ministry of Business. And we expect that we'll be able to work in conjunction with some of the other Caribbean countries to develop that aspect of tourism. But people want to see our animals, people want to see our rare orchids, people want to see our birds, people want to see our beautiful waterfalls. There is actually no other CARICOM country with such a tourist product as Guyana has. So I'm very confident that ecotourism is going to be one of the economic horizons of the future.
Mr. President, if I may, the Iwakurama International Center for Rainforest Conservation and Development is celebrating 20 years. You've been promoting that facility as a center of learning. Now we've seen the introduction of concepts like biomimicry, which calls for, essentially calls for a training of a whole new cadre of scientists. How can Iwakurama be readied to play a critical role in this area? What, in your view, needs to be done, particularly at the level of the government, to develop the capacity of the center to ensure that we can take full advantage of all the opportunities that biomimicry will present?
To start with, we need to have a second look at the policy behind Iwakurama. There has been a tendency to regard it as an area for sustainable logging, for entertainment, but at the center of it all, I think it should be education, and that is why we've been calling for the establishment of an Institute of Biodiversity. Already students come from Britain and elsewhere, and we would like to see Guyanese students, students from the West Indies, coming to Eurocrama to study our biodiversity. So I think that is the most important element in Eurocrama's moving forward, the use of that center as a center for education in biodiversity. So I would say that is the direction we have to go in, and I believe that some of the other areas would not propel Eurocrama as forward as quickly as education. So we want to establish an institute there and get young people going there to study our biodiversity. I don't know if that satisfies you.
Thank you, sir. Any other question on this topic before we move on?
Your thoughts on the recent passage of the wildlife bill and how it will work in conjunction with the protected areas?
Well, I think we're all disappointed, except of course the smugglers. We're all disappointed when we go along a street in Georgetown or elsewhere in the countryside, you see people, a string of iguanas, or we hear stories about people smuggling towels in the curlers, or we see photographs of people going into protected areas with huge freezers or refrigerators, catching some species which will be quite rare. So it needs to be brought under control, and that is one of the reasons why we are separating it from the extractive industries, because these animals are more important to us, they're more profitable to us, alive than dead. And we need to set up the mechanisms for enforcement. And to back up the bill, we intend to introduce a corps of wardens in the hinterland to protect not only the mining areas. We recently had another mining accident, but also in the forestry areas and in the areas of wildlife, in the areas of tourism. So we're developing a corps of rangers who will enforce the law. Part of our problem in the past has been legislation, but another part is enforcement of that legislation. So by the passage of this bill, we will be able to guarantee the protection of some of the world's most valuable flora and fauna. So it is necessary, but it's also necessary to put the administration and enforcement of that act under the Department of Environment. The Ministry of Natural Resources has its work cut out, particularly with the opening of the petroleum sector, with mining, with logging. So we don't want to overburden that ministry. So the passage of the wildlife bill is very, very important, because right now there has been excessive smuggling, there's been excessive endangerment of some species. As you know, a few years ago, somebody is actually exporting dolphins. Many Guyanese have never seen a river dolphin, but we have dolphins. But that person is able to find dolphins and export them at great profit. So we need to be very careful, very cautious in future. And that's what the bill is all about.
Thank you, sir. The floor is now open for questions on any other topical matter.
Mr. President, over the years there have been criticisms that the Guyana Marketing Corporation has not been performing up to speed or according to its mandate. In addition, there are cases whereby we are importing secondary products when we have the primary products, we produce the primary products right here. What is the administration's plan to not only boost the marketing corporation, but also boost manufacturing and packaging locally?
Well, this is an area of great disappointment, I would admit. As you know, in Parika, there was a major facility which is still underutilized. And part of it is perhaps a shift in policy. When the Guyana Marketing Corporation was first conceived, the original Marketing Corporation, it was essentially a state-owned enterprise which tried to bridge the gap between the market and the producer, the farmer. As a result of that, several bonds were constructed countrywide, but there was, when the administration changed, the policy changed, and the farmers were expected to contact the market directly. So the intermediate role of the marketing corporation was diminished, and now it depends on the farmers as private entrepreneurs to go to the market directly. So what you're asking is that the government intervenes between producer and market, but this is a new proposition, and I'm not sure it can work. We will help. The government will help. And I've been at Perico recently. I've spoken with farmers, and they can contact the markets directly. For example, in production of sweet potatoes, they can go to the outlets, like the fish shops, and sell the sweet potato chips, sell plantain chips, sell cassava chips directly to those enterprises. But as far as exportation is concerned, the government wants to work with the farmers to allow them to get access to the Caribbean single market and economy, to access markets in Trinidad, Barbados, Grenada, and other parts of the Eastern Caribbean. So it is a new area in the sense that the old formula had been abandoned, the old model had been abandoned, and we now have to reestablish ties with our farmers. But the farmers have to produce first. You can't have a market with no production. And that's what we're trying to stimulate. We're trying to stimulate production at village level. And once that happens, we'll be able to assist them in getting markets in the Eastern Caribbean. But it is a work in progress. We have not abandoned the farmers. And when I was at Perico the other day, 3 weeks ago, I certainly asked them to start using that facility more than it is being used at present. And we are prepared to put facilities in other regions, for example, in the hinterland regions, which have a problem in getting their produce to market. So it is something that the Minister of Agriculture Holder has been exploring, and I expect that we'll be able to encourage farmers to produce more and get that produce to market.
Thank you, sir. Alva?
There's a topical issue which has arisen this past week in the Ministry of Health bond, pharmaceutical bond.
Yes.
Just your opinion, sir, on how you think the process has been handled. It led to the company, the entity being awarded the contract for holding pharmaceuticals here.
The Ministry of Public Health attempted to avoid the pitfalls of the processes which prevailed under the previous administration, in which a single corporation had more or less been given like single source, carte blanche. And they created a huge bond because that corporation had more or less, I think, expected that the government would always buy from them, maybe in perpetuity. But what happened is that the new administration decided to bring an end to single sourcing. So when that was announced to the corporation, which benefited from single sourcing, it decided to charge the government a very high rate for the use of its bond, which had been built into the cost before. So the government found it impossible to pay the new rate being charged by the corporation under the previous arrangement. So it was almost punitive. And that caused the Ministry of Public Health to seek a new bond. That is how it all started. And in seeking that new bond, the government obviously had to think about timings. It had to think about the short-term storage of drugs. And it led to the adoption or the quest for a new bond that is on the Linden Holding, on a new company. So it was an act that was driven by necessity, not by any sort of perversity. It was an act because the old arrangements by single sourcing had been criticized and had been brought to an end. And once the corporation that was the beneficiary of that old system discovered that, they imposed what were regarded as punitive rates, and the government had no choice but to seek a new bond in order to store the pharmaceuticals. So that is the genesis of the problem.
What are your thoughts on the Cato Secondary School, which would have cost over $700 million to construct, but cannot be used to this day due to the defects?
Well, it shows you the challenges that the present administration is facing, because there was a big rush prior to the elections in May last year to finish these projects at any cost in order to demonstrate, that the previous administration was doing so well. So it is quite clear. Anyone, I think the media went in there, there were architects who went in there to examine the building. It's quite clear that the work is substandard. It is unsafe to put children in that building. So we're now, the government is now faced with the responsibility to do massive work to correct the faults, to make the place safe for use by children. It's a burden that we will have to bear. We will see what legal measures could be put in place to recover the excess expenditure from the contractors. But he certainly is not going to be given any more contracts to do that type of work. People feel that once you're dealing with the hinterland, you could do any sort of shoddy work and nobody will go there to check. But things are different now. We've had bad roads, we've had bad buildings, we've had bad stillings. And this administration has been faced with the challenge of correcting a lot of bad work which is tolerated by the previous administration. Look at the Bridge at Hope. It's very expensive to correct the wrongdoings of the previous administration. But as far as the school is concerned, we're concerned with education. We want to see the children in school, and we will do whatever is necessary to rectify the faults in that building, which are massive, and make sure the children could enjoy safe classrooms and safe dormitories, and have their education on the same standard as children in Greenwich Park or Hope or anywhere else on the coastline.
A follow-up, how far do you see corrective measures being taken to address this building? Do you see possibly a new school having to be constructed?
We have not gotten that advice, but the Ministry of Public Infrastructure, as you know, has done a complete examination of the building. We've had technically qualified people to look at it, and whatever is necessary, we will do to make sure that the children of the Pajaro-Tipperary region have a safe environment in which to study. So we will do whatever is necessary to rectify the faults, and as far as possible, we will try to recover the cost from the contractor.
Let's have a last question. This has to do with the Venezuelan nationals who have been found to have illegally entered Guyana. There has at least two additional cases have been before the courts in recent times. Yeah. I think today's newspaper has one. Does the government plan to address this issue in terms of the humanitarian side of it?
Yeah, from a humanitarian point of view, yes. Once we find migrants who are prepared to, who are fleeing, economic or political persecution, and who are prepared to abide by our laws, we will attempt to give favorable consideration. We are not going to simply open our borders to a flood of migrants, people who are just casually drifting in and out. But if there is evidence of political persecution or economic deprivation, we are prepared to give favorable consideration to this. And the Minister of Citizenship is aware of that. As you know, migration is a very ticklish problem. We don't want to have people who are guilty of any wrongdoings or involved in terrorism coming into our country. Right now, there are problems on our border. There are groups called sindicatos, which simply means a gang or a syndicate, which have been terrorizing some of our indigenous people in the Cuyuni-Mazaruni region, particularly in the Venamo area, Venamo and Cuyuni areas. So we have to be very careful. So yes, we're prepared to accept Venezuelans or people of any nationality on humanitarian grounds, but at the same time, we have to protect our citizens from abuse.
Final question. It has been over a year, and we still do not have a fully functioning integrity commission. Could you give a timeline whereby the government is envisioning setting it up? Because currently it doesn't have a chairman, so can you give a timeline that the government is working with?
What I can give you is an objective. That is that we want a properly functioning commission. What has happened in the past is that it was functioning like a post office. People were submitting their returns, but no action was being taken. And there was a perception that the previous administration was simply using the Integrity Commission, or not using it at all, or using it as a means of simply, rather than preventing corruption, as a means of, maybe just checking on people's personal finances, to use that maybe for political purposes, I don't know. But we are looking at tightening the legislation to make sure that persons who may have committed illegal acts are actually prosecuted. Right now, it does not happen. So we are working on the legislation. It will be brought to cabinet, and I expect before the end of this year, there'll be a functioning Integrity Commission. But right now, what we inherited from the previous administration is unworkable. And you can see the attempts that the previous administration made, appointing chairpersons. It was poorly funded, poorly administered, and it was just a dysfunctional organization. We are going to create functional laws, functional organization structure, and I expect that by the end of this year, when Parliament resumes in October, we'll be able to bring that legislation before the National Assembly. So give us time. But the work has to be correct. We cannot go into it with what we had before.
Mr. President, to follow up, do you see any overlapping in terms of the roles of the role of the Integrity Commission and the role of SOCU?
No, there are two different functions. Integrity Commission is a constitutional body, and it requires certain categories of public officers to submit returns. That is, that at the policy-making level and a level of officialdom, it is meant to oversee the behavior of public officials, mainly. SOCU is much wider. It is largely connected with money laundering, and it therefore would deal with the banking system, it will deal with commercial transactions, it will deal with other officers who may not necessarily be public, other officials from different companies and corporations. So there are two different levels, Anybody could be reported to SOCU who is likely to be maybe a businessman, a trader, who is accused of money laundering or smuggling, could be reported to SOCU. But that would not necessarily be the business of Integrity Commission. If a minister of the government or a permanent secretary is accused of committing some improper transactions, he could be reported to the Integrity Commission because he has to submit returns. And if the transactions are unrelated to the returns, he could then be subject to prosecution.
Thank you, sir. Any other question? Before we close, sir, on a lighter note, Guyana sent a team to the Olympic Games in Brazil, and Guyanese have been following the events very closely. We're all sitting with our fingers crossed, hoping for gold. What message do you send to our athletes in Brazil?
Well, bring back gold. Unfortunately, Olympics is not a matter of hope. It is a matter of preparation. We did our best to prepare our athletes who are now in Rio for the Games, but it should be a lesson. It's a learning experience that we have to do a lot more to organize sport at the level of schools, at the level of villages, the level of the community, the level of the regions. Quite recently, as you know, I was in Camarang to witness the Upper Mazroni District Games, and you can see the talent. But Guyana has to put infrastructure in place to make sure our young people get the best preparation. So I give, my best wishes go out to the team, but at the same time, we have to ensure that the infrastructure is in place for our athletes, our swimmers, our footballers, so when they go to international competitions, they could be assured. So we could remove the hope and the guesswork and be more certain of getting silver, bronze, and gold. But we have done well. We have a team there, and the government of Guyana, all governments support their athletes. And I hope that at the end of the day, we will be proud of the persons who represent us there. So I personally wish them good luck. And you know why.
That's all the time we have this week. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Alva and Jarrell. And thank you, viewers, for watching. Do join us again next week.